All right, so this is Astro's website, which is available on astro.build. This is where you can find various resources and of course Astro's documentation. And as you can see, they label themselves as the web framework for content-driven websites. Essentially, Astro is an all-in-one web framework that has been designed for speed. And we're going to start putting together a very simple Astro application just to take a look at the very basics of the framework itself. And as you can see, in order for us to get started, what we need to do is run the npm create astro at latest command. So I'm going to copy this, go to my editor, and I'm going to open up my terminal, and then I'm just going to paste this command in. So let's hit enter, and then let's see what the terminal says. All right, so first thing that we need to specify is the name of the project. I am just going to call this Astro 101 because this is going to be an intro section. Now, as you can see, the next thing that we can do is to select a template. Now, Astro allows us to create a block template. That's the second option. Include some sample files, which is recommended, but we are going to go against that recommendation for the time being because I just want to create a blank, empty Astro project. Astro also supports TypeScript out of the box, but in our case, we will not be writing TypeScript, so I'm going to say no here. And then we would like to make sure that we install the dependencies as well and that we initialize a new GitHub repository. So we're going to say yes to both of these options. And then we're going to get an Astro 101 folder created, and let's just wait for these dependencies to install. All right, now that the project has been created, let's open up the Astro 101 folder and just take a look at the contents. So we have a bunch of files and folders in here, and we're going to be focusing on a couple. First and foremost, notice we have a source folder. This is going to be the place where we will create our Astro application. And in there, straight away, you can see a pages folder, which contains an index.astro file. So this is already telling us that Astro is using file system-based routing, and every single root is going to be an individual file. And in this case, we just have index.astro, but just FYI, you can not only use the .astro extension, but you can use markdown files, so .md, .mdx, .html, and of course .js or .ts extensions as well for API endpoints, but more on that later. We have the public folder as well, where you have an icon for the time being, and of course we have this file here called the astro config.mjs. So this is where we can specify some of the behavior of Astro. For example, if we would like to change from its static side generation mode to server-side rendering mode, this is the place where we would define that. Also, if you want to add any extensions, any plugins, this would be the place to add that. Now, we are in a very fortunate situation here because the Astro CLI also allows us to add bits and pieces to the configuration kind of in a semi-automated way, but more on that later as well. And the rest of the files, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. We have a package file, we have a tsconfig.json. As I said, we're not going to be writing TypeScript, but there's your TypeScript configuration file, and everything else is just a standard node modules folder and a VS Code folder with some settings for Visual Studio Code, the editor itself. Okay, now that we have this particular project installed, let's take a look at the content of index.astro. And we are going to look at this and analyze what we see here. So essentially, any Astro files, those are the files with the .astro extension, will have two parts or two sort of distinctive sections. One is going to be the template or the HTML template, i.e. what the browser should display. But you also notice this top section, which is denoted by these three dashes, or this is, sometimes called the front matter part of the Astro file. In between these three dashes, we can write JavaScript code. And it's very, very important to understand that the JavaScript code that you write on top of the Astro files is going to be executed in a server-side setting It's going to be executed at build time, not at request time. Okay, so this is the default behavior of Astro. So Astro's default behavior is static site generation, meaning that the application that you will be deploying to any of these providers, Netlify, Cloudflare, Pages, doesn't really matter, is going to be generated when you create a production build. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. This is going to be the simplest Astro file that we put together. So let me add a variable here, for example, name, and let's give this a value, John, for example. So I can define variables. I can run any sort of JavaScript in here because this is going to be executed when the project gets built. But the beauty of this is that I can go ahead and reference the variables and everything else that I create here inside the top section of the Astro file within the templating section. So instead of saying h1 Astro here, I'm just going to say something like hello, and then use the curly braces to evaluate the name variable and then put an exclamation mark in here. And I'm just going to hit save. Now, of course, once we have this sort of example ready, the next thing that we need to do is open up our terminal. Let's just clear this. Just make sure that we also go to the right folder. And now we can execute npm run dev, which is going to fire up a developer server for us on localhost 4321. If this port, for whatever reason, is being used on your machine, then Astro will find another port, maybe 4322, so on and so forth. And so now we can open up the browser. And as you can see, the h1 message that we have here is hello, John. Now, of course, if I put this to the right, and let's say I put this to the left, and now if we update this variable to say Kate, for example, and hit save, then of course the page is going to automatically refresh in development mode. And you can see that whatever we put here in the h1 is going to be using the value for the variable that we've defined in the top section. And this is really, really great because, as I said, this JavaScript is going to be executed on the server side. And as such, you can make fetch API requests in here. You can make database queries. You can do whatever you want, also using API keys and API secrets, because whatever you put in here is never going to be exposed to the browser or to the client side. Okay, so just remember that Astro has these two sections. One is the top section denoted by the 3 dashes. That's where you can write some JavaScript code. And then you have the bottom section where you can generate some templates. Now, of course, you're never going to be writing entire HTML pages out like this. So let's actually take a look at some layout options. But before we do that, let's also add a new root. Now, adding new root is basically as simple as just adding a new Astro file to the pages folder. And then I don't even need to specify the actual 3 dashes here. I can just put in any HTML, like a paragraph, and say, this is the about page, for example, hit save. And now all I need to do is go to my browser and go to /about, and now we have the about page. Of course, I could create folders in here as well. So if I create a folder, say about, and then inside that about folder, I create 3 or 4 additional Astro files, then I would just need to follow the path inside my browser as well. Now let's talk about layouts. So as I said before, the .astro pages could contain an entire HTML document like so. It makes sense, however, to replace this and create a generic layout that is going to be applicable for every single Astro page, and then just insert some HTML into that layout for every single Astro page, as opposed to repeating the entire HTML sections. Now, you can use a dedicated folder to put your layouts inside Astro. So all we need to do now to create a layout is to go into the source folder and just create a new folder there, and let's call that layouts. Inside this layouts folder, let's create a new Astro file, which is going to be called layout.astro. And inside this layout.astro file, we can now specify a very basic HTML structure. And I would like to draw your attention to this special element here that you see in line number 4 called the slot. The slot is going to be the place where every single Astro file's content is going to be injected. And we're going to take a look at this in just a moment. But before, let's actually fix some of these issues with the layout, because clearly there's some meta information missing. And of course, we should maybe also add a navbar component of some sort as well. And while we're going to be discussing this, I'm going to talk to you about the component system inside Astro, because inside the Astro framework, you can actually create components. They will have the .astro extension as well. And let's just create one that is going to be called, say, navbar. And I like to add that to my layouts as well. So I'm going to create another file in here called navbar.astro. And then we're going to specify how this should look like. And I'm just going to add a very simple nav element in here, where we're going to take a look at just 2 navigation items for now. href, this is going to be to the home page, and then another href, which is going to go to /about. All right, and that's all what I need to do, because now once I have this navbar.astro file, I can come here to my layout file and I can import this. So I need to import my Astro components and other Astro files on the top of the section, essentially in this JavaScript execution context. And all I need to do is say import navbar from, and then just specify the path, which is going to be navbar.astro. And once I do that, I can now use navbar as a component like so. All right, so this is going to be good enough for us for now. Let's take a look at how to actually make sure that the content of index and about.astro would be added where the slot component is, which is a built-in thing used by Astro. So what we need to do in order to do this is essentially import the layout and the pages where we want to use the layout itself. So I'm going to go ahead and import that here. Just make sure that you also add the extension like so. And then now we can remove this HTML and just leave the H1, which is really the content that we want to display on the main page. And we need to make sure that we wrap this around the layout component like so. Okay. And if we do this, that means that essentially the H1 is going to be the content that is going to be added where the slot is. And then we can do the same at the about page. Again, making sure that we import the layout, and then we just wrap this in between the layout elements like so. And now if we go back to the browser, you will see that we have the navigation bar and we have the about page. And if we click home, we just go back to the home page, and then we can swap between these 2 pages. It's very, very easy. The one thing that I would like to point out to you, but hopefully you've already noticed this, is that unlike with some other front-end frameworks out there today, you don't need a dedicated component to create a link between the pages. Astro just uses 100% standard HTML, including the anchor element, to create links between the various pages that it has. All right, so far so good, but of course our application still needs some work. And the next thing that I would like to talk to you about is the dynamic feature and then API endpoints that you can work with inside Astro. There are, of course, situations when you have an unknown number of parameters for your route. What I mean by that is now inside the pages folder, we created an index and an about page. But what if you have some data coming in from a CMS, for example? That could be a list of destinations, a list of blog posts, a list of whatever else. Now, it would be very, very unwise for you to try to manually create a .astro file in the pages folder for every single potential scenario, for every potential route that your application would have to handle. Luckily for us, Astro has a solution for that. And Astro calls this feature dynamic route, right? Because the value of the route can change, and then Astro will be able to handle those dynamically. Now, if you're using the static site generation mode, which we are still using right now, we need to tell Astro programmatically what are all the potential options for a given route. And we need to use one of its built-in functions, which is called getStaticPaths. So let me walk you through an example on how to do this. First of all, let's create a new file under the pages folder. And to denote a dynamic route, we need to wrap the name of the route in square brackets like this. And I'm just going to call this destination.astro. And so every time when you see a route with square brackets like this, that indicates a dynamic route. And then inside the front matter part of our Astro file, I am going to just have a list of destinations, and I'm just going to have a couple of countries in here. You know, this information could come from a CMS, from a REST API call. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to display these statically for the time being, just to display to you how to use dynamic routes. Now, let's assume that you have these 6 routes available for you. You need to tell Astro on how to actually generate the pages for all available destinations. And as I said, the way you would do that is by specifying a special built-in function called getStaticPaths. So I'm going to type in export function getStaticPaths. And inside this particular function, we are going to be returning something that must adhere to a format. And the format is that we need to return an object that has a params property. So what I'm going to do, we're going to take the destinations array, we're going to iterate through that, and for each destination inside that array, we are going to be returning an object where we have a params property, and the params property is just going to be the destination itself. Okay, and then we're going to hit save, and then in the HTML template section, I'm just going to write something like h1, or actually let's also add this to our layout like that. So make sure that we import our layout. And then in here, I'm just going to add an h1 that says welcome to, and then just print out the destination itself. Now, the one thing that's missing from here is, of course, where are we going to get the destination from? And this is where we need to talk about some of the built-ins inside Astro. Now, Astro exposes a bunch of built-ins via a globally available Astro object. And so if you think about this, destination, the name of the file that we have specified, is going to be the changeable parameter, right? So destination can be London, it can be Rome, it can be San Francisco, so on and so forth. And that is the data that we're going to send and manipulate using getStaticPaths. So we need to somehow capture the destination itself. And luckily for us, as I said, we can do that by looking at the astro.params object. So Astro is a globally available object, and one of the available properties on that object is called params. And we can very easily just destructure destination from astro.params like so. Okay, and once we do this, we can hit save. And there's a quick error because I meant to put this particular array inside the function itself, so apologies. And now we have welcome to London. Now we can do /Rome as well, and now we get welcome to Rome. We could do Singapore, and then we're going to get welcome to Singapore. Now what I would like to show you, and this is going to be really, really cool. Let me just quit this particular process and just do an npm run build which is going to create a production build of our Astro project. And you will see that currently there's a step that says building static endpoints. And look at this, because this is a dynamic endpoint, ahead of time, or rather at build time, Astro was able to generate all the HTML files for all the destinations that we have. And that means that if I now deploy this particular project, I would not need to worry about making API requests or doing anything, because it was done for me at build time. And if you look into the dist folder, you can see that there are individual folders for all these destinations, and you can go into London and notice this is the entire HTML. We have the navigation, we have welcome to London, and that's pretty much it. So I could literally take the content of this HTML file and put it onto GitHub pages or anywhere else, and it would just work. So this is really, really amazing. So by now you see how using Astro's static site generation is quite amazing. However, there are situations when it's just not going to cut it. Because what if you have some data that is highly dynamic? For example, this could be an e-commerce store, for example, whereby you have product listings, you have the available quantity of the products, and if someone purchases an item, you want to make sure that if the next person loads the page, you have the updated product quantity available. But that's not going to be possible in an easy way if you have static site generation. Now, you could, of course, always make sure that if the data changes, then you rebuild the entire site, and then therefore the product quantity is then going to be updated and reflect the reality. But let's face it, if you have a site where lots of purchases are being done, that's just not going to be a viable solution. So what you need to do is opt in for Astro's server-side rendering features. And that is exactly what we're going to take a look at right now.